Have you ever wondered who decided that life had to feel so heavy, who decided that simply existing was no longer enough, that every moment must be measured against some invisible standard, that to live without constant evaluation is almost a crime? At what point did living stop being spontaneous and became a task, a project, a performance that must be justified to someone, even if that someone exists only in your imagination? Perhaps you wake up and already feel it, a pressure in the air, not spoken but palpable. Be better today, do more, figure out who you are, fix your life, discover your purpose, prove to yourself that you are worthy of being here. And so the fatigue begins, not in the body, not as exhaustion of muscles or organs, but in the mind, deep in the shadows of consciousness, a constant hum that never ceases. The weariness of someone who observes themselves, judges themselves, compares themselves endlessly, as if an invisible gaze follows every decision, every small choice, every mistake too minor to be forgiven, and still too important to ignore. No one talks about this, and yet everyone feels it. You live under the assumption that life is something that can be done wrong, that existence itself is conditional, that you must earn the right to rest, to be, to simply be present. And so you push forward, always moving toward an imaginary point in the future where everything will finally make sense, where you will finally arrive at a place of peace, of understanding, of accomplishment, of acceptance. But what if that point never comes? What if it never arrived because it never existed? Perhaps the mistake is not in you, but in the question you have been asking. The assumption that something must be achieved before you can finally rest inside yourself. You try to become better the way someone tries to reach their reflection in the water. The closer you get, the more the image dissolves. The more effort you apply, the more frustration appears. And yet you keep trying, hypnotized by a promise that later will be different, that later you will understand more, that later you will heal, that later you will become someone, that later you will finally be at ease. And the early hours have their cruel honesty. When the world is silent, when distractions disappear, when the noise fades, the question returns in a whisper. What if nothing is missing right now? What if this search for meaning, for approval, for enlightenment is only a story you learn to tell yourself? A narrative that made sense once but has no real foundation. A tale repeated until it feels inevitable. No one gave you a manual. No one explained the rules. And yet you live as if failure is always around the corner. As if the world were waiting for you to prove something you never agreed to, never signed up for, never even imagined you could fail. Alan Watts once said that humans suffer less from events themselves and more from the story they create about them, and perhaps the cruelest story of all is the belief that life demands performance, that you must always achieve, always improve, always become, always act, always justify, always fix yourself, as if every day is a test, every action a grade, every thought a measure of worth. Observe your mind gently and you will see it turn everything into task, every relationship into project, every rest into guilt, every silence into unproductivity, even suffering into something that must be done correctly. Too much suffering is weakness, too little is insensitivity. Suffering the wrong way is moral failure. And even tired, you keep trying to get it right, because the quietest part of this prison is a subtle sense that something is wrong with you, not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough that you can never fully relax, wrong enough that you postpone inner rest indefinitely, wrong enough that every moment becomes a rehearsal, a preparation for a self that never arrives, a future self that exists only in theory. But what if that sense of deficiency is not a personal defect, but the natural effect of treating life like an exam, of living as if there were a judge, an authority, someone who knows the answers and decides if you deserve to move forward? Ask yourself honestly in the quiet, who is evaluating you? Not God, not the universe, not life itself. Only one possibility remains. You have become the inspector of your own existence, the judge, the collector, the voice that is never satisfied. And here lies the almost tragic point. You are trying to pass a test created by your own mind, using standards that shift constantly. Today measuring productivity, tomorrow spiritual progress, then inner peace, then authenticity, then emotional mastery, always changing, never fixed, always unattainable. And that is why the fatigue is so deep it cannot be remedied by sleep. Because it is not the body that is tired, it is the character, the persona you built to survive a world of evaluation, the persona that believes it must justify its existence, the persona that confuses value with utility, that confuses presence with performance, that confuses being with achieving. But there is something strange and powerful about the stillness of the early morning, when no audience exists, when no expectations linger, when the world slows down, and something in you begins to breathe differently. And then the question returns, quieter, more honest. What if I didn't have to prove anything? What if living was not about getting answers right, but simply being present while the question unfolds? This is not surrender, not irresponsibility. It is something far rarer. It is the release of the fight against your own experience of being alive. Perhaps life never demanded performance. Perhaps it only asked for presence. And perhaps the relief you are seeking does not lie in doing better, but in realizing that there was never an exam to pass, that you were already here, that your presence does not require justification, that nothing outside yourself can confirm or deny your worth. Perhaps the endless striving was simply the mind trying to find a solution to something that dissolves only when you stop moving, when you stop pushing. When you stop trying to reach a future that never existed, and in that stopping the water stills, the reflection is seen, and the tension that never ceased finally begins to release. You may have spent years believing that improvement is the path to peace, that becoming someone else, someone better, is the only way to earn rest, to finally feel aligned, complete, acceptable even to yourself. You wake up with an implicit understanding that you are not ready yet, that something inside you needs fixing before life can be enjoyed lightly. And without noticing, you begin to treat the present as a draft, a rehearsal for a future self who may never arrive. Every moment is measured, every thought analyzed, every emotion catalogued, every failure weighed as if it defines the totality of your worth. You live as if there were a scoreboard tracking your existence, a silent judgment always waiting to determine whether you are enough. And the strange thing is that no one ever told you the rules. No one ever confirmed that this test even exists, yet you behave as if it does. And the suffering persists not from life itself, but from the constant effort to measure yourself against invisible standards, from the narrative that insists life must be earned, must be mastered, must be understood, and that only after doing all of these things will you finally be allowed to rest. Observe your mind carefully and you will see how it transforms existence into tasks, into projects, into obligations. Relationships become calculations, silence becomes guilt, rest becomes justification, and even your pain must be fixed, must be understood, must be resolved in the correct way. Too much pain signals weakness, too little pain signals insensitivity. The wrong type of suffering is a moral error, and so you keep moving, even exhausted, because giving up feels impossible, because the very act of stopping is interpreted as failure, because the mind convinces you that life is a test and you are perpetually failing it. Perhaps the quietest and cruelest part of this prison is a subtle but persistent sense that something is wrong with you, that you are never enough, that the internal scoreboard is never satisfied, that you must always adjust, always improve, always prepare for some unknown evaluation. But consider this. What if this exhaustion is not a personal flaw, not an error in your character, but the natural consequence of treating life as if it were a performance to be judged? A test only makes sense if there is an examiner, someone who knows the right answers, someone who decides whether you deserve to move forward. Ask yourself, who is judging you? Not God, not the universe, not life itself. Only one possibility remains. You are the judge. You have been both the examiner and the examinee, the critic and the subject, the collector of evidence against yourself, and the one who never accepts the verdict. And here lies the tragedy. You have been striving to pass a test that never existed, using criteria that constantly shift, standards that move faster than you can adapt, measures that change depending on your mood, your culture, your perception of success, your self-criticism. One day you fail because you did not produce enough, another day because you did not feel enough, then because you did not evolve spiritually, then because you did, but not the right way. It is a race without a finish line, a treadmill that accelerates every time you think you are catching up. That is why the fatigue is so deep that it cannot be solved with rest, for it is not physical tiredness but existential. It is the exhaustion of the character, the persona you built to survive in a world that has no rules except the ones you internalized, the persona that confuses value with usefulness, presence with performance, being with doing. And yet there is a strange and merciful quality to the early morning hours, when the world slows, when there is no audience, when the pressures of daily life fade, the persona begins to dissolve, and a quieter question emerges. What if I never needed to pass anything? What if living was not about getting answers right, not about solving problems or achieving goals, but simply about being present as life unfolds? This is not surrender. It is not irresponsibility. It is a realization more radical than accomplishment. It is understanding that the constant striving, the obsessive measuring, the endless correcting, is not necessary. Perhaps life never demanded performance. Perhaps it only asked for presence. Perhaps the relief you have been seeking does not exist in doing better, but in realizing that you were never being tested at all, that the exam was imaginary, that you were already here, already enough. That presence does not require justification. That existence does not require validation. And when this begins to settle, a subtle shift occurs, not explosive, not dramatic, but quiet and profound. The hum of perpetual self-judgment softens. The mind continues to comment, but no longer commands. You notice that you are no longer trying to force life into a structure, no longer attempting to control every outcome, no longer struggling against the current. There is room for something else: presence, awareness, simplicity. Eating when hungry, resting when tired, feeling sadness without turning it into a problem, feeling joy without fearing its loss. You realize that this is not about becoming someone else, about fixing yourself, about earning your existence. It is about noticing that the persona you've been carrying, the you who believed it must justify itself, is no longer necessary. You already exist, here and now, and perhaps the life you were searching for, the peace you were seeking and striving and achieving, was never elsewhere. It was only waiting for you to stop resisting. And in that stopping, in that release, the water stills. The reflection becomes visible, and the exhaustion begins to resolve itself, not as energy gained, but as presence allowed. The story that you learned to tell yourself, That narrative of insufficiency begins to loosen, and for the first time, you sense that you are not behind, that you were never broken, that life was never a test, and that perhaps the most radical truth of all is that everything you have been striving for was already here, in this moment, waiting only for you to notice. And when you realize that nothing is missing, that there is no point you must reach to finally exist at the present, is not a rehearsal for a future self, but the stage where life is already happening, an unusual lightness begins to emerge. Not the lightness of euphoria, but the lightness of no longer carrying an identity that must be proven, justified, or perfected. You notice a quiet laughter rising from within, not mockery, not sarcasm, but recognition. As if after years of searching for glasses that were always on your face, you finally realize that the weight you carried was never yours to bear. All the striving, all the correction, all the rehearsals for an imaginary audience dissolve quietly, almost the tension that had been pressing from inside loosens. Not because you achieved something, but because you stopped trying to achieve what never needed achieving. You begin to see that all the effort, all the anxiety, all the striving was a response to a mistaken belief, the belief that life is something to pass, that it is something to control, something to master, something to earn. And as this understanding settles, a strange relief spreads through your mind. Not triumph, not victory, but recognition, as if waking from a long illusion. There is no exam. There never was one. You have never been behind. You have never failed. You have never been late. And with this realization, the present moment, once heavy with expectation, becomes something else entirely. The past loses its venom, the future loses its authority, and now, the present no longer feels like an obstacle. You notice that life continues with its challenges, its losses, its uncertainties, but without the constant undertone that something is wrong with you. Without the persistent feeling that you must prove your worth just to exist. And in that quiet, you notice something astonishing. When you are no longer trying to pass, life flows more naturally. When you are no longer trying to get it right, you respond with more clarity. When you are no longer trying to be someone, there is space simply to be. This is not passivity, it is liberation. The energy that was consumed in self-evaluation, self-criticism, self-justification, now remains as presence. And presence, you realize, is a kind of intelligence that does not come from effort, from striving, from planning. Perhaps that is why the idea of you have already passed does not feel like a conquest but like remembering something obvious. Something too simple to have been noticed before, like realizing the door was never closed, only that you were pushing against it while it had always opened inward. And with this realization comes a subtle ease, a gentle buoyancy that is not happiness or excitement, but relief. The quiet lifting of tension, the identity you once carried, rigid and demanding, begins to relax, and you notice that you were never required to become anyone else in order to be enough. You laugh inwardly, softly, a laughter that recognizes the futility of years spent trying to justify your own existence. Perhaps what you have called awakening is only this, the cessation of treating life as an evaluation and beginning to live it as it always was, a continuous unfolding without final grades, certificates, or external approval. The moment comes quietly, not like a revelation, not like a triumph, but like a fatigue that is different, more subtle, asking nothing of you except honesty. How much longer do you plan to keep pushing? And at some point perhaps now you begin to notice that constant effort to maintain life has been leading nowhere, that it has only kept you too busy to notice that stopping is not the end but a return to the simple fact of being. Stopping never seemed safe, because you were taught early that pause is danger, relaxation is negligence, letting go is weakness, but you pushed on, even when motivation was only fear, even when life felt more like an obligation than an experience. But there is a profound difference between giving up on life and giving up on the struggle against it. The day you can stop is not the day everything resolves. It is the day something inside you understands that you no longer need to correct yourself in order to deserve existence, that you no longer need to monitor yourself constantly, that you no longer need to turn every emotion into diagnosis, every pain into task, every silence into something that must be filled. Watts expressed this with unsettling clarity. Human suffering persists because we insist on trying to improve what was never broken. And perhaps you begin to feel it not as an idea but as a direct experience, an internal loosening, a strange absence of urgency, as if the pressure that had always pressed from inside has finally stopped shouting, has finally paused. In this sense, the world does not change. Responsibilities remain, uncertainty remains, challenges remain. What changes is your relationship to them. Life ceases to be something to master and becomes something to traverse, not as someone attempting to control the current but as someone learning to float. You realize that you were never truly in command, and instead of panic, relief arises. The tension came from attempting to hold something that was never under your control. The future loses the power to blackmail. The past ceases its relentless interrogation. The present, for the first time, does not appear as an error waiting to be corrected when you can stop. The mind continues to speak but no longer rules. It suggests, comments, opines but does not govern. In that space, something forgotten emerges. A simple way of being alive that requires no justification. Eating when hungry, resting when tired, feeling sadness without making it a problem, feeling joy without fearing its loss. None of this makes you better, but it makes you real. You notice that for years you tried to become acceptable even to yourself, and now, quietly, you discover that you no longer need that project. Not because you achieved an ideal, but because you are tired of treating yourself as an error in progress. The day you can stop carries no applause, no certificate, no spiritual label. It simply occurs when you cease resisting the fact that you are already here, that life demands nothing more than presence, that you need not reach any place to finally rest inside yourself. And in that rest, something curious happens. Life continues, but with less friction, less internal conflict, without the constant feeling that you owe existence something. Perhaps the rest you sought for so long was never at the end of the road. Perhaps it was only waiting for the moment you stopped running. And when that happens, there is no enlightenment, only silence. And for the first time, that silence does not frighten you. Perhaps nothing of this was about learning something new. Perhaps it was only about remembering that you are not late, that you were never broken, that there is no test running in the background. Life does not wait for you to get it right. It is already happening while you breathe, while you listen, while you are here. And perhaps the greatest rest is not understanding everything but finally ceasing to argue with the simple fact of existing. And when this begins to settle, you notice a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, a soft release inside. The constant evaluation, the self-criticism, the endless striving, they begin to lose their grip. You are not changing the world outside. Challenges remain. Uncertainty persists. Life continues to unfold with all its unpredictability. What changes is your relationship to it. Life ceases to be something to dominate and becomes something to traverse, something to experience, not as a controller, not as someone holding the reins, but as someone learning to float, to move with the current instead of against it. You realize that you were never truly in control, and that insight does not bring panic but relief, because the tension came from trying to hold on to something that was never under your command. The future loses its power to intimidate, the past no longer interrogates, and the present no longer appears as a mistake waiting to be corrected. When you can stop, the mind continues to chatter, but it no longer rules. It suggests, it comments, it observes, but it does not command. In that space, something forgotten emerges. The simple, unobtrusive awareness of being alive, without justification, without expectation, without performance, eating when hungry, resting when tired, feeling sadness without converting it into a problem, feeling joy without fear of losing it. None of this makes you better in the usual sense, but it makes you real. You notice that for years you tried to become someone acceptable even to yourself. And now, quietly, without fanfare, you realize you no longer need that project, not because you achieved some ideal, but because you are tired of treating yourself as an error in progress. The day you can stop carries no applause, no certificate, no spiritual label. It simply occurs when you cease resisting the simple fact that you are already here, that life requires nothing beyond your presence, that you need not reach any external point to finally rest inside yourself. And in that rest, something remarkable happens. Life continues, but with less friction, less internal struggle, without the constant sense that you owe existence something. Perhaps the rest you sought for so long was never at the end of a journey. Perhaps it was only waiting for the moment you stopped running, and when that stopping occurs, there is no enlightenment, only silence, and for the first time, that silence does not frighten you. Perhaps none of this was ever about learning something new. Perhaps it was only about remembering that you are not late, that you were never broken, that there is no background test. Life does not wait for you to get it right. It is already unfolding while you breathe, while you listen, while you are here. And perhaps the greatest rest is not understanding everything, but finally ceasing to argue with the simple fact of existing. This realization is not dramatic, not sudden, not cinematic. It is quiet, subtle, like noticing you have been holding your breath and suddenly letting it go. The recognition that you have already passed, not because you did everything right, but because there was never anything to pass, never a finish line to reach, never a test to complete. And perhaps awakening is only this: the cessation of treating life as an evaluation and beginning to live it as it is, a continuous unfolding, without final grades, without external validation, without certificates, without someone measuring your worth. You are already here. You are already enough. And in that simple awareness, the mind loosens, the body relaxes, the heart lightens, and a deep, quiet relief flows through your entire being. Life continues, but you no longer push against it. You move with it. You float with it. You allow yourself to exist without justification. You realize that the constant effort, the self-imposed pressure, the invisible scoreboard, all of it was unnecessary. And now, you breathe. You are here. You are alive. And finally, that is enough. That is all there is. That is the moment of quiet, subtle liberation. The moment you stop struggling to pass an imaginary test. The moment you rest in the simple truth that life has never required more than your presence, and that presence alone is, and always was, enough.